So today is the start of a new long-term project, and this is our main antagonist. This is a print of a skinwalker. Yes, it looks like a werewolf, but skinwalkers are somewhat similar. We'll get into them more later. But I'm going to be using this as a Lord of Change at the start of a Chaos Demons force. And we'll talk more about the lore and the background of that shortly. But to start with, we've got to think about this guy's base. Now, a Lord of Change is quite a large model and stands fairly tall, so I wanted to reflect that in the base here because the 3D print you've just seen isn't massive. So I took a cork table mat from IKEA and broke it up into pieces. This is a great source of high density cork that is perfect for our purposes today. I built it up layer after layer with hot glue just to ensure that this model had the menacing height that is required to be a Lord of Change and the Warlord of the army. I want this themed army to be in some kind of enchanted wood that's sick and ill, something like you might see with Nurgle models but with a weird magical twist. Less to do with corruption and being ill due to the war, but just being wrong in general, and it's always been that way. It's old magic, it's not warp magic. With the building blocks complete and our skinwalking looking suitably imposing, it was time to add some foliage. I have these awesome trees from Epic Basing. This is not sponsored, they're just a great service, and I printed them off nice and quickly and started dry fitting them around to see where I'd like them to sit. Once I was happy and I was sure that they weren't going to obstruct the model but actually elevate the base and make everything look better, I hot glued them into place. There are a lot of crevices and small caves in this base thanks to the shape of the cork and the way that it was torn up, so I'm going to add a little bit of rock, rubble and debris into those areas using Mod Podge and some aquarium stones. I put down the tray I usually use for spraying miniatures in order to not get stones all over my desk, but I still managed to. It helped a little bit, but I'm just clumsy. Once the Mod Podge was down all over the base, it was just a simple matter of sprinkling the stones from above. At the end of this process I made sure I knocked the base so any loose stones that aren't touching our adhesive are thrown onto the tray, so when we come to spraying we don't just end up with stones everywhere. Everything was still fairly uniform at this stage, so it was time to change that up with some Vallejo thick mud. I used a palette knife and scraped this all over the base to add some nice overhanging tufts and bits of dirt like you'd find in a really wet forest. It looks a lot like icing a cake, and I'm really hungry, so this isn't great right now. Whilst I was doing all this, knowing that it had to dry afterwards, I was also having my printer running in the background, printing off more stuff to put on this base, namely branches, because these are going to be a really useful way of breaking up the terrain even more and tying in those trees to our rocks. With our nice gnarled branches all cleaned up and ready to go, I started applying them to the base onto the wet Vallejo mud. I wanted this place to look overgrown and untouched by civilization, so having gnarled roots everywhere and fallen branches all over the place will really help. I made sure some poked out of the rock like the roots of trees, and to help them along the way I added a bit of Mod Podge because the Vallejo mud wasn't as sticky as I'd hoped. The next step was to add some cool hanging vines and lichen. So I found this bag from Woodland Scenics, took out the autumn colours, the colour really doesn't matter at this stage because we're going to spray it later, and mixed it up in a mix of PVA glue and water. This makes it easier to mould and drape over the trees and also helps it dry a little bit stiffer later, which is going to be great to help us with painting. I also added a few bits in clumps over the ground just to break up that terrain even further, and the base is really starting to come along now. Now while I kit bash this cool dreamcatcher, let's talk about the theme of the army and what a skinwalker is. I have been fascinated with Native American folklore for a long time because it is truly some of the scariest out there. One of the main creatures you may have heard of from folklore is the Wendigo, which is a cannibalistic creature that can never be sated. This was my gateway into this type of folklore, and it truly scared me, so there's definitely one of those coming along later, probably going to be a bloodthirster. But of all the folklore creatures, none are quite so reviled as the Skinwalker. The Skinwalker is from Navajo culture, and it's a type of witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as an animal. They are the antithesis to everything that Navajo culture deems to be proper. There is generally a reluctance of the Navajo to talk about this Skinwalker because it is so evil. As a result, it's not generally well understood, but it can mimic people's voices and is generally seen as a killer. They are almost impossible to kill, only able to be killed by a weapon that is rubbed with white ash, much like the silver bullet in our werewolf legends in European culture. But unlike how the werewolf is portrayed as a slathering, mindless beast, the Skinwalker is intelligent and will use that intelligence to track down, corner, mutilate, and kill its prey. Some believe that even talking about them will bring them down upon you. There's a phrase in Navajo that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce for fear of offending anybody, but essentially it means, with it, he goes on all fours. So that's a quick background on the terrifying Skinwalker. I highly recommend looking it up and listening to some podcasts about it. But that's why I chose it to be my warlord. It's intelligent, cunning, dangerous. Why wouldn't it be? And the fallen healer angle, it's got to be a lot of change. Back to the hobby though. The Dreamcatcher is now complete, and I'm quite pleased with how it looks. Time to add a few more totems to really spruce this base up. I grabbed some Raven Guard bits because there's a few bird skulls, feathers and claws hanging about which would look perfect on this base. I also took an Imperial Fist relic and cut off the fist part so I could attach this crow claw or raven claw to it. Using a dab of super glue, I attached these to the trees. That's the base all built for now, so let's start painting our creature. I started with a very simple Zenithal Prime. We're not going to spend too long on this because the key focus is the base, but I covered it with Contrast Wildwood, which is an excellent brown base coat. I also painted the loincloth with Basilicanum Grey, just for a change of pace. Skipping through most of the base coating, I also painted his tongue with Flesh Tearers red and his teeth with Xandri Dust. For some super easy highlights over this nicely textured fur, I dry brushed some Mournfang Brown on. I then went up with a mix of Mournfang Brown and Balor Brown before going to a tiny bit of pure Balor Brown. I scratchily highlighted the loincloth with some Dawnstone. I also made sure to shade the teeth with some thinned Rhinox hide, just to make them look a bit dirty. I base coated the eyes with a bright yellow. I also highlighted the teeth with some Ushabti bone. There's our Corrupt Warlord complete, let's move on to painting the base. I also started this with a Zenithal Prime before switching to my airbrush and using the same Wildwood paint but spraying it all over the bark, the trees, the mud, basically wherever it could go. With the brown base coat down, I added some Stegodon Scale Green to add some really dark turf. This would make it look slightly different to the normal kind of green grass you'd see. The next step was to highlight all of the trees, the branches and the roots, using a mix of Rhinox hide and Dawnstone. Adding grey into the mix here would make the trees look dead, like they hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time, and really contribute to the eerie vibe we have going on the base. Now, to add a bit of variation over the turf, I used some Athonian camo shade to really make it dark and grimy. As you can see, I used healthy amounts here all over the turf and parts of the trees and base. Next up, I thinned down some Death Guard green to paint all the creepers, vines and lichen. This was a little bit fiddly, but ultimately it ended up looking quite nice. Then I painted the Dreamcatcher using Mournfang Brown for the wood and using a mix of purples to highlight up the threads. Dark blues and purples alongside the drab greens and browns really help this base look like it's nighttime or in the deep forest. I then used some Panzer Grey to base coat a few of the rocks just to add a little bit more differentiation. Nature is very rarely monochromatic. A lot of the fallen branches and roots had little mushrooms all over, so I painted all of these purple, which was a really good choice it turns out, because it adds a lot of colour and contrast to this base. Moving on to a few effects, I used some Nurgle's Rot and added some nice green slime all over the place. This will look like some wet moss. After the Nurgle's Rot, I went in with some Blood for the Blood God to add some blood channels, runnels and splatters all over the place. I mean, of course we're adding gore, it's a horrible creature from Native American folklore, we've got to add gore. Then I carefully pinned our antagonist to the base. Once attached to the base, we had to add a few more blood splatters and stuff to our Skinwalker to make him look really disgusting and horrible. I also mixed up Blood for the Blood God and some Uhu glue to make some really disgusting gore and strands running from his mouth and fingers to the trees. Unfortunately, this is where my camera died, so we don't get to see the rest. But that is the completion of our monster. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think. I've been Sam. See you next time.